Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Thanks, Vicki. It's always good to come back here. Wendy, my colleague, and I were talking at over dinner at Patty Malone's, and I was telling her how in the summer of 1991 we moved 150 tractor-trailer loads of paper from 1000 Industrial Drive, a big warehouse down the street, to this building without losing a damn thing. That was pretty good. Well, I'm thrilled to be here tonight, and thank you all for coming out on what is not one of the most pleasant evenings we've had in a while. Let me set the stage. I'm going to read a little bit to you tonight, but not very much, so I apologize in advance, or that you could think of this as your bedtime story. I want to read just a little bit from the very beginning of the book to sort of set the stage. The book begins with an epigraph from what I think is still one of the great books of the 20th century, a book by W.B. Du Bois titled The Souls of Black Folk. It's still a must-read, I think. And Du Bois starts that book off with this sentence. The problem, he writes, of the 20th century is the problem of the color line, the relation of the darker to the lighter races of men. I think if Du Bois was here today, he'd say the problem of the 21st century is the problem of the color line. We still haven't figured it out. So I write early on in the book, and again, I want to read this to set the stage. I have been deeply interested in the color line for most of my life. Like W.B. Du Bois, I think that the dominant problem of the 20th century and the 21st century, certainly for Americans, has been race. For nearly half a century, I've devoted the bulk of my professional life to studying, researching, and writing about race in Missouri history. It's an improbable journey for someone who grew up during the 1950s in one of the most homogeneous, all-white communities in this state. I knew one African American as a child, a middle-aged man named Oscar Toad Anthony, a World War II veteran who lived in the small mid-Missouri town of Chamois, or as the locals say, Chamois, in northeastern Osage County. Although I did not know it at the time, Toad was the last member of what had once been a thriving African-American community of hundreds of persons in and near Chamois that dated to the antebellum days of slavery. I had no African-American schoolmates or playmates. Once when I was 12 years old and playing baseball on a team of similarly aged boys from the nearby town of Lynn, I came face to face for the first time with some African-American boys, also my age, from Jefferson City. I'd never encountered a black person my own age. A group of us, white and black, stood making small talk around the pitcher's mound of a baseball field, while all the time I tried to muster the courage to reach out and shake the hand of the boy nearest me and tell him that I thought black people and white people could and should be able to get along, and that I wanted to be his friend. But the gesture was not made, the thought remained unspoken, and the opportunity was lost. So how in the hell did that kid become somebody interested in African American history? A lot of it had to do, if I can get this to work. Okay. Emily, Well, give us just a minute to figure out the technology. Doesn't seem to be advancing. That could be the problem. Yeah, I can't seem to move it. Okay. You see why I struggled with the nuns and Our Lady of Help? A lot of the reason that I became interested in what I've done for a living for the last 40 years has to do with this man, Lorenzo Johnston Green. And I should tell you that I don't know how far I'll get in my slides and how far I'll get in the talk. So I recall giving a talk a number of years ago, and this woman who played the piano in this church finally got up and went to play and let my people go. So if somebody starts humming or whistling that tune, I'll know that I've overstayed my welcome. Lorenzo Green, for those of you who might have known him, or for those of you who didn't, came to Jefferson City in 1933. PhD from Columbia University in New York. He was the research assistant of Carter Woodson, who was the father of Black history. Woodson is the guy who started what was then called Negro History Week, now called Black History Month. And Woodson and Green worked as his research assistant in the late 20s and early 1930s. And I encountered Green in the mid-1960s as a world civ teacher who I thought was an expert on ancient Greece and Rome because he knew so much about it. I had no idea that his expertise was in African American history. And by the way, I hated history. As a kid, history had always been taught to me as names and dates and places you had to memorize. I wasn't very good at it. I didn't see why my people should know what dead people did. And I really went to Lincoln University because it was affordable and it was close to my home. Nobody in my family had ever gone to college. In fact, my parents hadn't gone to high school because there was no high school to go to. And I went to Lincoln University to be a social worker. I still wonder about that and how and why that happened. But the only time I remember a television in my school was when the nuns brought a TV in for us to watch John Kennedy's inaugural address, the first Catholic president. And I was profoundly impressed by and enthused by the optimism and hope of the Kennedy aura. And at a very relatively early age, I read Michael Harrington's The Other America. And I was gonna fix the problem of poverty. And I went to Lincoln University to study sociology under the redoubtable Oliver Cromwell Cox, who had a lot to do with my deciding to not be a sociologist. But I was a junior in college before I decided I wanted to be a historian. And there were really two things that influenced that. One was the Vietnam War, which I wanted to understand because many of you know that my close friend Paul Hasenbeck was missing in Vietnam, has been missing since April 1967, never found him. And that drove that war home to me in a very personal way. Why is this happening? So I read history to try to understand it, not to take a test. And then the Civil Rights Movement, starting with Watts in 1965, and then Newark and Detroit, and then the massive riots in 1968 after Martin Luther King's assassination. Again, I wanted to understand why are those riots happening? And so I enrolled in a course that Lorenzo Green taught called The Negro in America. The course split at the Civil War, although I got to tell you, in the first course we didn't make it out of Africa. But somewhere along the line, Lorenzo Green and I became friends. he became a mentor, and again, it's one of those mysterious things. I was talking to a young student today who's thinking about going to the University of Missouri as a history major next year, and I told him the simple truth that if you're a kid in college and you find a professor who takes a personal interest in you and who will mentor you, it's one of the greatest gifts you'll ever be given, and I was very fortunate in that regard. I want to talk a little bit about why, and I'm not going to go in chronological order in this book, but I want to talk a little bit about this place called Lincoln University when I went there and how it had been for the previous 3 decades, because it really is a remarkable story that I don't think a sufficient number of Jefferson City and Central Missouri people understand and appreciate. It really starts with World War I in a lot of ways, even though Lincoln was much older than that. Lincoln goes back to 1866 when Civil War soldiers started the school after the war. But the dramatic change in Lincoln occurs in the World War I era when African Americans fought and died for their country, and encouraged by people like Du Bois, who wrote a powerful article in Crisis magazine encouraging blacks to put all of their efforts in the war effort, but then after the war to demand the full rights of citizenship. He called it the double V campaign: victory at home, victory abroad, victory at home. So after the war, African Americans in Missouri and elsewhere began to say things like, our people fought and died in this war. We should have the full rights of citizenship. And one of the things they wanted was access to the University of Missouri. Well, Missouri was not about to open the University of Missouri to black students. And so essentially white legislators responded to this request for access to a university by changing the name of Lincoln from Institute to University. There, you got a university. The one good thing that came out of that was that they also increased Lincoln's appropriation that year by $500,000, which was an enormous amount of money. And that allowed this man, Nathan B. Young, to begin to recruit an Ivy League trained cadre of professors from places like Harvard and Yale and Cornell and Columbia University and other places. And so in the early 1920s and 1930s, Lincoln became widely known in the black community as the black Harvard of the Midwest. I should tell you that the legislation to create, change Lincoln's name from Institute to University was sponsored by the first black legislator elected in Missouri history, Walter Moore from St. Louis. Keep this in mind for perspective. From 1921, when Walter Moore first came here, until the early 1960s, 40 years later, when black legislators were elected from St. Louis and Kansas City to serve in the Missouri General Assembly, they couldn't stay in housing anywhere. They couldn't stay in hotels in Jefferson City. So they stayed in a room in Allen Hall, which is still there on the campus of Lincoln University. And then they took their meals in Swish Hall, which was then, it's still there, but it was then the cafeteria. So, I mean, ponder that. People elected as the duly chosen representatives of sections of the state could not take meals in the Capitol, couldn't get housing, couldn't get a room in Jefferson City. So anyway, Nathan Young started hiring some really incredible faculty. And fortunately for me and a lot of people in my generation, those guys stayed for 30 and 40 years. One of the first was a guy named Cecil Blue, who was a professor just out of Harvard, who came here and stayed here until he died in the 1970s. But one of the most intriguing guys who came 2 years later in 1926 was this guy, Sterling Brown. Now, Sterling Brown was only here a few years. He too was a Harvard graduate. Cecil Blue and Sterling Brown, and then you add Lorenzo Green, they called themselves the Color Boys. Sterling Brown and Blue were just remarkable people. Brown was from Washington, D.C. He and Cecil had gone to high school together at what was originally called the M Street School, later the Dunbar High School in Washington, D.C., a school that produced a lot of Harlem Renaissance writers. And it was Cecil who talked Sterling Brown into coming out here, and Sterling Brown only stayed 2 years. He had a lot of trouble with the Lincoln administration. That would not happen today, but in those days, he was very interested in black folk culture and folk music. And he liked to hang out in the dives down on the Foot. And in those days, you couldn't play jazz or the blues on the Lincoln campus. That was considered low-class Negro music. You had to play classical music. So Sterling Brown didn't stay long, but some of his most famous poetry is written about Jefferson City. He wrote a poem about the Osage River, guy from Washington, D.C. He wrote a poem called Checkers, which was a poem about a checker game that occurred down at the foot of Lafayette and Dunklin Streets every Saturday night between a local ne'er-do-well and the pastor of the Second Baptist Church. But my favorite collection of his poems is a series of poems that he called his Slim Greer poems. And Slim Greer was a black waiter in a local hotel in Jefferson City. So, and these were written in the 20s and the 30s, mostly in dialect. Sterling Brown was a great Harlem Renaissance writer. And let me just share my favorite, if you would, Slim Greer in Hell. Slim Greer in Hell. Slim Greer went to heaven. St. Peter said, "Slim, you've been a right good boy," and he winked at him. "You've been traveling rascal in your day. You can roam once more, then you come to stay. Put these wings on your shoulders and save your feet." Slim grin and he speak up and he say, "Thank you, Pete." Then Peter say, "Go to hell and see all that's doing and report back to me. Be sure to remember how everything goes." Slim say, "I'll be seeing you on the late watch, bro." Slim got to cavorting, swell as you choose, like Lindy in the spirit of the St. Louis Blues. He flew and he flew till at last he hit a hangar with the sign reading, "This is it." And then he parked his wings and strolled around, getting used to his feet on the solid ground. Big bloodhound came a-roaring like Niagara Falls, sicked on by white devils in overalls. Now Slim wasn't scared, cross my heart, it's a fact. And the dog went on obeying some poor devil's track. Then Slim saw a mansion and he walked right in. The devil looked up with a sickly grin. "Certainly didn't look for you, Mr. Greer. How it happens you come to visit here?" Slim say, "Oh, just thought I'd drop by for a spell. Feel at home, sir, and here's the keys to hell." Then he took Slim around and showed him people raising hell as high as the first church steeple. Lots of folks fighting at the roulette wheel, like old Rampart Street or leastwise Beale. Showed him bawdy houses and cabarets. Slim thought of New Orleans and Memphis days. Each devil was busy with a devilish broad, and Slim cried, "Lordy, Lordy, Lordy, Lord." Took him in a room where Slim seed a preacher with a brown skin on each knee. Showed him giant stills going everywhere with a passel of devils stretched dead drunk there. And then he took him to the furnace that some devils was firing. Hot as hell, and Slim start a mean perspiring. White devils with pitchforks threw black devils on, and Slim thought he better be getting along. And he says, "This makes me think of home. Vicksburg, Little Rock, Jackson, Waco, and Rome." And then the devil gave Slim the big ha-ha, and he turned into a cracker with a sheriff's star. Slim ran for his wings, lit out from the ground. hauled it back to St. Peter's, safely bound. St. Peter said, well, you got back quick. How's the devil? And what's his latest trick? Slim said, Peter, I really can't tell. The place was Dixie that I took for hell. Then Peter said, you must be crazy, I vow. Where the hell do you think hell was anyhow? Get on back to the earth, because I got to fear you's a little too dumb for to stay up here. Really, really interesting character. A lot of these guys taught their classes in this building that many of you may remember. I had classes in this building, torn down in the early 19th. Anybody have classes in this building? Not as many of you as I thought, but it just reflects my advancing age. This is the building where Lorenzo Green's office was, and Oliver Cromwell Cox. This was kind of the heart and soul of Lincoln University. This is a place where Lorenzo Green published a journal called the Midwest Journal for a period of about 9 years, from 1948 to 1957. This is a building which had a rather incredible theater where Langston Hughes would come to deliver his poetry. And in fact, Langston Hughes wrote in this Midwest Journal. If you read this Midwest Journal today, it's like a who's who of many great scholars of African American history and literature. One of the Langston Hughes poems that occurred early on in this journal, one of my favorites, is a poem and a response, high to low, and then, low to high and high to low. Let me just read those quickly for you. Low to high. How can you forget me? But you do. You said you was going to take me up with you. Now you got your Cadillac. You done forgot that you were black. How can you forget me when I'm you? But you do. And then the response, high to low. God knows we have our troubles too. One trouble is you. You talk too loud, you look too black, don't get anywhere, and sometimes it seems you don't even care. The way you send your kids to school, stockings down, not ethical culture. The way you shout out loud in church, not St. Philip's. And the way you lounge on doorsteps just as if you were down south, not at 409. The way you clown. The way, in other words, you let me down. Me trying to uphold the race, and you, well, you can see we have our problems too with you. The Midwest Journal was an incredible piece of literature. As I said, if you know anything about African American history and the writers of African American literature, and you read this journal, it's like reading the who's who of people who've become famous. John Oak Franklin, one of the most famous black historians ever, published early in this journal. But the journal had a troubled history, and I'll tell you about that just briefly. In 1949, in the second year the journal was published, this was the year of the Communist Chinese Revolution. This was the year that the Soviet Union exploded its first atomic bomb. And Lorenzo Green had the bad judgment, perhaps, to publish 2 articles that were very controversial. One was an essay by W.B. Du Bois called The Freedom to Learn. It's now a very famous essay. But in The Freedom to Learn, Du Bois argued that Americans, rather than being afraid of communism, should try to learn about it and understand it, a novel idea. The more controversial essay that he published was an essay by a Chinese communist praising the Chinese Communist Revolution. And that's the one that really did it. A local printer in town, whose name I shall not tell you, was printing the journal for Lorenzo Green, and he saw this stuff, and he called the FBI. And soon thereafter, Lorenzo told me on a Saturday he was working in his office, there was a knock at the door, he was an FBI agent wanting to know what in the hell he was doing, publishing this kind of literature. And so for the rest of the tenure of the Midwest Journal, the FBI followed Lorenzo in the journal. And through the Freedom of Information Act, a number of years ago, I was able to get those files, and it's really pretty interesting. Also, at the same time, Oliver Cromwell Cox on the Lincoln campus was being followed by the FBI because of a series of books he wrote, a trilogy that criticized capitalism. One of the books, still a famous book called Caste, Class, and Race, published in 1948, was regarded as pink literature and caused the FBI to follow him. Cox, by the way, came to Lincoln in 1948 after years at Tuskegee in Alabama. When he came to Jefferson City, he couldn't get housing. And so he moved into that same dormitory where the legislators were staying, Allen Hall, and he stayed there for 22 years. Because even after Jefferson City passed an open housing ordinance and it became a federal crime, he was frankly too embittered to move out. So he just stayed in the dormitory until 1970. At that time, Missouri had a law which required a mandatory retirement at age 70, and Cox tried to stay and Lincoln wouldn't allow him to stay. And so he went to Wayne State University where he became a professor and died there a few years later. So anyway, my point is that Lincoln has a fascinating history. And it is an incredibly rich cultural institution that I think Jefferson City should be incredibly proud of. I want to move next to the only annotated document in here that is a speech by, I included it for several reasons. It was an essay, or a newspaper article that Tony Holland and I found in 1973 when we were working with Lorenzo Green on publishing an article in the Blue Book. Lorenzo was contacted by Secretary of State James Kirkpatrick to write the feature article for the Blue Book on the history of African Americans. Then it was called The Role of the Negro. And Lorenzo had a heart attack, not because of Kirkpatrick's request, but so he asked Tony and I to do the research and to write a draft of this. And we found this document because Lorenzo taught all of these classes with historical documents. And so I thought it was fitting to include this document. It's a speech by this guy, Richard Baxter Foster, called An Address Upon the Colored Schools. And it's his effort in 1869 to write about the challenge faced by African Americans in their efforts to go to school, not just in the state as a whole, but here in Jefferson City. He talks, for example, about the first two teachers who were hired to teach in a black school being stoned by local residents. He doesn't mention, but I can tell you that in July of 1866, a couple of months before Lincoln Institute opened its doors in September of 1866, the local newspaper called the Tribune ran an article in which they condemned the idea of a black school being established in Jefferson City, expressing the fear that, quote, Jefferson City would become the Negro Mecca of the United States if this black school called Lincoln Institute opened. The school, of course, was opened anyway. But Foster was a white lieutenant, second lieutenant in the 62nd United States Colored Infantry. He was a Dartmouth, New Hampshire Congregationalist minister. Don't let that or his mild looks fool you. He rode with John Brown in Kansas. He was a dyed-in-the-wool abolitionist who first tried to come to Missouri and set up his school in St. Louis and couldn't get any support there. So he turned to Jefferson City because the radical Republicans were in power, and they were the political party that advocated abolition, or emancipation rather, and also the education of African Americans. And so he thought by coming to Jefferson City, he would have much greater support. It turned out it didn't quite work that easily, although he did get some support from Governor Thomas Fletcher and some of the radical Republicans. I want to share a couple of sentences from this piece. He describes the first day at Lincoln Institute, which was then in an old abandoned schoolhouse, log cabin, where Simonson is now, on what was called Hobo Hill. And he writes, "The rain is pouring in torrents. As I approach the schoolhouse, I am stopped by a creek." Where's creek? It's been a problem for a long time. The bridge over which has been swept away, usually fordable, but now impassable by reason of the flood. A half-hour's detour and the scrambling of several fences brings me to the sanctuary of learning. And what a sanctuary! The rain pours through the roof scarcely less than outside. I could throw a dog through the side in 20 places. There is no sign of a window, bench, desk, chair, or table. In this temple of the muses, I meet two pupils. And that's how Lincoln started. There is a section toward the end of the address he gave. He gave this speech here in Jefferson City to a meeting of politicians. And he really interestingly, late in the speech, he calls for what today we would call reparations. He talks about a friend of his, a guy named Cyrus Trigg. Now, some of you who have been around a long time may remember Joe Trigg, who taught math at Lincoln many years ago, back in the 70s. Joe was a descendant of Cyrus Trigg, who was one of the few free blacks. He was freed just before the Civil War as an old man. One suspects he might have been freed so that his master didn't have to take care of him. But I'll just read this one little section. He writes, of African Americans generally, what he's trying to do with the speech, he's trying to drum up support for public funding of black education. And he writes, "To give them now the widest possible opportunity for education, to let them have the fuller chance to find out what capacities God has given them, is perhaps to lessen the obligation, but it is not to cancel it. The debt is one which from its nature and from its magnitude can never be paid. It is true that they have not much property to pay taxes." Again, he's talking about the freedmen now. "To pay taxes on, but let society restore to them the earnings of which they were feloniously deprived, and they will need no help. A particular case will put this in a clearer light than a general statement. My friend and neighbor, Cyrus Trigg, was 68 years old when freedom came. For 30 years, with stout muscles and vigorous health, he had done a man's work and received a slave's wages. Now, considering that money was formerly worth more than its present value, reckon his worth at $100 a year, more than such food and clothing as he received, and interest averaging 25 years at only 4% and not compounded, and we have $5,000 principal." And he goes on to say, basically, it's not just his former master, but it's the state of Missouri and indeed the United States that owes Cyrus Trigg at least $5,000. I'm not going to get into the reparations discussion, but I found that to be a really interesting approach to the issue. I can see I am going to run out of time. I'll try to go a little quicker here because I want to get to some other things. This is an image of the first building built on the Lincoln University campus, built in 1871, destroyed by fire in the early 1890s and replaced by the building that I showed you earlier. This was the first memorial hall. I went to school in the second memorial hall. There's now a third memorial hall on exactly the same spot on the Lincoln campus. This building was built, by the way, largely by 25 Missouri State Penitentiary convicts. I want to move to what for me is kind of one of the saddest segments of this book, and it's about something called the Missouri Industrial Home for Negro Girls. The Missouri Industrial Home for Negro Girls was an institution built as a consequence of Missouri's unwillingness to allow white juvenile delinquent girls and black juvenile delinquent girls to be housed together. In the early, just after the First World War started, Missouri went on a crusade of trying to find a place to build a reform school for black girls, and nobody wanted it. And finally they settled on plot of land just outside of Tipton. The building is still there. It's part of the Missouri correctional system today. Way back in the early 1980s, before John Dugan was archivist, before Ken Wynn was archivist, before I was archivist, there was a guy here named Gary Behan who was archivist. And one day Gary Behan said to me, I've got a whole box of juvenile court case files back here. You want to look at them? Now today, John, you wouldn't even let me near those. But I got them and used them, and this is how things have changed. I called the Division of Youth Services, told them what I had, asked if I could use it. Sure, just don't mention any names. And so I did. And this was a facility that tried to replicate a home environment under the assumption that what these juvenile delinquent girls were missing was a mother figure and a strong home. So they were required to call the matron, who in the 1930s was this woman, Ethel Bowles. She had to be called Mother. And these case files are from the 1930s. Mother Bowles and nobody who worked there had any training as social workers. This was the most prestigious political appointment for a black woman in the state. So it was a political appointment. Corporal punishment was widely used. I found records of girls as young as 7 who were described by the courts as incorrigible and were sentenced to stay at the Tipton home until they were 18, at which point they could be moved into the Missouri State Penitentiary. But the saddest thing I encountered was this girl who had been abused by Mother Bowles. And abuse is not the right word, it probably is, but Mother Bowles didn't see herself as abusive. She saw herself as trying to correct their behavior. So this young girl writes a note that is found in her Bible, and it's a parody of the 23rd Psalm. Listen to this. Mother Bowles is my shepherd. I am in want. She maketh me to lie down on the floor. She leadeth me beside starvation. She torments my soul. She leadeth me in the path of death for her name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear evil, for she is with me. Her rod and her staff, they meet me. She breaks down my defense in the presence of mine enemies. She anointeth my head with whelps. My cup is empty. Surely hatred and revenge shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in hell forever and ever. Is that not one of the saddest things you ever heard? It's really a fascinating institution. It remained the Missouri Industrial Home for Negro Girls until the mid-1950s, when the penitentiary riot occurred here in September 1954. The women's prison was up where now the museum has the space where Surplus used to be, and where the green building is for Lewis and Clark. That was called Prison Farm Number 1, and it later became, in the 1920s, the women's prison. So when the women saw the men riding down the hill, they rioted. And the women were shipped out of Jefferson City to Tipton. The black girls were shipped to Chillicothe and housed with the white girls. And that facility in Tipton became the women's prison until in the early 1970s, there was a riot there. And Carolyn Atkins, who was the superintendent there, was stabbed and nearly killed. And so then the women were moved out of there and moved to the Wren's Farm, and then they stayed at the Wren's Farm until the '93 flood, when they were moved to Vandalia. Vandalia, by the way, is the first prison facility built in the state of Missouri specifically designed for women, and that didn't happen until the 1990s, but that's another story. Okay, I'm going to move around down the road a bit to, I'm going to stop here in a little bit and give you a chance to ask questions, because I know we're not going to get through Still having trouble with this thing. Okay, the switch is on. There, now I went too far. Well, yeah, okay, don't move. Nobody moves, nobody gets hurt. A lot of what I've done in the last couple of decades has been the consequence of doing what historic site cultural resource survey, National Register nominations, that sort of thing. This happened, by the way, in kind of a quirky way. Harry will remember Mike Kettler, and in the late 1970s, in those days, Lincoln was having financial trouble. That's happily no longer a problem, but I was teaching in the history department. I had just gotten tenure, and somebody was going to have to go. And it looked like it was going to be my friend Mike Kettler. And so I wrote a grant to the Office of Historic Preservation because nobody was doing anything on trying to identify and save Black historic sites, sites associated with African American history. So I didn't know what I was doing. I knew nothing about architectural history, still don't. But I wrote this grant, and we started something called the Lincoln University Black Historic Sites Program in 1978. And so I began to try to find and identify structures around the state that had relevance to Missouri's African American history. And so a number of the things that I found, like the Missouri Industrial Home for Negro Girls, were sites like that. And one of the things I came across was something called Lake Placid. There's a gentleman here, Kent, where are you? You told me you grew up not very far from this, but never been there, and had always heard about it. Lake Placid is not that far from here. It's at a corner of Morgan County, and it just lapses a little bit into Benton County. It is a recreational lake built in the 1930s by this man, Dr. Percy C. Turner, who was a Black physician, superintendent of what was called General Hospital No. 2 in Kansas City, which was the Black hospital, segregated hospital. Dr. Turner was a hunting and fishing fan, and there was a small Black community in Versailles. There's still the building standing in Versailles. That was the Booker T. Washington School, just down the street from the Second Baptist Church, and so he would come out there and hunt and fish. And in the early mid-1930s, he also conducted a nursing school at the Black hospital for Black nurses. And so after graduating his first class, he tried to take them for a celebration to the newly constructed Lake of the Ozarks. And they couldn't gain access to the Lake of the Ozarks because they were Black. So he bought a parcel of land out in the rural Ozarks near Versailles that happened to be for sale, a lot of land for sale during the heart of the Depression. Rocky, hilly, not worth a lot of money land. And then he decided that he wanted to build a lake. Now, how do you build a 15-acre lake in the heart of the Depression when you don't have any money? Well, of course, you get a federal grant. How do you get a federal grant on private property? Well, it helps if you know a guy named Tom Pendergast. This is a time, this is a very important time in Missouri and national political history when African Americans are making the transition from supporting the party of Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator, to the party of the New Deal and the Democrats. And there's another chapter in this book about a guy named William Tompkins. I'll tell you a little bit about him, and don't know if we'll get to the picture of him. He was born right here in Jefferson City on East McCarty Street, just a couple of blocks from the Madison Hotel, which stood where the the Governor Office building is now. His mother worked in the hotel there, and he was a busboy there as a young kid. He went to Lincoln Institute and then went to Howard University Medical School, came back, and in the first decade of the 20th century, Tompkins, now not this guy, became the first black superintendent of that General Hospital #2. And he quickly understood that if he was going to get anything done in Kansas City, he had to align himself with first Jim and then Tom Pendergast. And so later, Pendergast would underwrite the publication of a black newspaper called the Kansas City American as a counter messenger to the black Republican newspaper called the Kansas City Call, which is still published today. So Pendergast pumps money into the Kansas City American, makes Tompkins the publisher and editor, and starts to attack the Republicans and try to move blacks into the Democratic Party. So by the mid-1930s, Turner has become the superintendent of this hospital. Tompkins, the Jeff City guy, has gone to Washington, D.C. to work directly for Franklin Roosevelt. By the way, he'd come home in the summers and he'd buy Cole County hams and he'd take them back to the White House because the Roosevelts had developed a fondness for home-cured Cole County hams. He died in Washington, D.C. in 1943, and a few years ago I interviewed his one surviving daughter, Marion Tompkins Ross. But anyway, so Pendergast is trying to solicit the black vote at precisely the time that Turner is trying to get money to build a dam. And there was a guy, I can't remember his name now, but he was headquartered here in Jefferson City in what you remember as the JCD building, which was the headquarters during the 1930s for the WPA. Matthew Murray. He was a Pendergast lieutenant, which meant if you wanted a WPA grant in Missouri, you had to go to the director of the WPA programs for Missouri, Matthew Murray, who just happened to be Pendergast's man. Of course, some said that the governor, Guy Park, was. During the 1930s, when Park was governor, the governor's mansion was referred to as Uncle Tom's cabin for Tom Pendergast. So anyway, to make a short story long, which I'm very good at, Percy Turner gets a WPA grant through Matthew Murray and Pendergast to build a dam on this private piece of property with the stipulation that if ever there's a drought, they have to open it to the public. Now here we are in 2015 and there's never been a serious enough drought to open it. But, so what happens is that Turner begins to build a lake and sells lots off of it. And it becomes, first of all, it's a recreational area for black physicians from Kansas City. And then somebody knows a physician at Homer Phillips in St. Louis, and so they sell them a lot. And then some teachers start coming, and then some people from Topeka, and then Des Moines. And pretty soon, it becomes the central place for black recreation for water sports in the central Midwest. And it's an incredible place. A number of Jefferson City people own property there. I think some still do. In fact, my last knowledge of this was Mike Jones, the football coach at Lincoln, has a place there. Some of you will remember Chick Pullum. Chick's brother, Richard Pullum, who was a Tuskegee airman, a Tuskegee pilot, had a place there called My Blue Heaven. And Don Webb, who worked here in the Secretary of State's office and played football for the New England Patriots and was one of the first African Americans to go to JC, and may still own a lake there. It's a really incredible story, I think. In the mid-1930s, late 1930s, Turner sent a guy named Ketchum Snell to Lake Placid to recover from an illness. And Snell built this cabin that's still right there. This is a wall as you approach the main entranceway. And Ketchum Snell stayed 30-some years. He never left. In fact, he's buried just around the corner here because before he died, he said, I want to be buried so I can see who comes and goes to Lake Placid. I think one of the most interesting stories, though, about Lake Placid is what it has to say, or had to say, about race relations in the 1930s and 1940s in the rural Ozarks. Think of this. In rural Morgan County, in the 1930s and 40s, there's almost no white doctors. Here come all these black doctors from Kansas City. They don't have electricity at the lake. They don't have refrigeration. So what do? They trade produce. They trade medical care for produce to white folks. Okay? And the most amazing story, you see the woman standing on the rock on the dam? A woman named Alta Ray. I interviewed her daughters, who are now in their 80s. And they told me the story about how their dad was a worker on the WPA project that built the dam. And they lived nearby and they trade chickens and so forth for medical care. And Mrs. Ray, the woman standing up there, developed gynecological problems. And her husband said to her, Alta, better have Doc Turner look at you the next time you're down here. Now, this is a time when black men are being lynched for looking at white women the wrong way. So this guy says, have Doc Turner examine you. So Doc Turner comes down the next weekend. Miss Ray, you need a hysterectomy. I don't have any money. So Dr. Turner, the black physician, takes her in his car to the black hospital in Kansas City and performs a hysterectomy. And then the next summer, these two girls, who are now octogenarians, both needed tonsillectomies. Same thing happens. Doc Turner takes them to Kansas City. I tracked that woman down in the 1990s in a nursing home in Smithville. And her daughter went with me, and she told me, Mom's got Alzheimer's. She has good days and bad days. You may not even be able to talk to her. Anticipating that, I took a picture of Dr. Turner with me. And I showed her that picture, and she started weeping and repeating over and over again, what a wonderful man, what a wonderful man. That's an incredible story. There was racism, but there were also these gems of interracial cooperation that it seems to me should tell us something about perhaps how we ought to live. I started to say a quick story, but you know better than that. And then I'm going to open it up because we've been going almost an hour. Back in 1995, I was working on a project in Kinloch, Missouri, which is the sister city next to Ferguson. Long story about that. Many of the people who came to Kinloch came from the East St. Louis race riot in 1917 and up out of the South. And in the 1990s, when the city began to try to force blacks out of Kinloch through eminent domain so they could expand the airport runway, guess where those folks ended up? In Ferguson. People who already had developed a pretty hostile feeling toward government. So I'm working on this project, and by the way, in one of the things I've discovered in all of these communities I've looked at is that if you look back in the early 20th century in places like Kinloch or some of the rural communities I've seen in places like Pennytown and Saline County, you find communities that defy every stereotype of 21st century urban black life. You find very strong two-parent households, no divorce, no drugs, no crime, no teenage pregnancy. And so I'm working on this project in Kinloch, and I'm working with a volunteer who happens to be a very recently retired, very successful black businessman. And this is exactly the time when the O.J. Simpson trial is going on and the jury is out. So one day, Bill and I go in his red Corvette, not my Ford pickup, to a restaurant not far away. And so I, in my attempt to make conversation, I who think O.J. Simpson is guilty as hell, I say to Bill, Bill, the jury's out. Yeah, Bill says, the jury's out. Only one conclusion they can come to, I say. Yeah, Bill says, only one conclusion. And he kind of pauses for effect. He says he's innocent. And I'm shocked. I'm shocked because he doesn't see the world the way I do. And he, being the polite man that he was, proceeds to tell me in a gentle, quiet way how being a black man driving a red Corvette in St. Louis has been rousted and arrested more times than he can count by policemen who first assumed that he has stolen the car. And when he can persuade them that he is not, their next assumption is that he either is a pimp or a drug dealer. What was he saying to me? He was saying to me that his history and my history were fundamentally different when it comes to relationships with policemen. And the single most important explanation for the difference is race. It's my contention that in a fundamental way, blacks and whites in this country see the world differently. Not on everything, but on a lot of things. And we see the world differently because we have different histories. If I'm right about that, it seems to me that it is absolutely incumbent upon all of us to try to understand each other's history, which is the point of my being here tonight and the point of the book. Thank you very much.